part of Jewish history that the remnants of it, the legacy of it, is always there, but interestingly not talked about a lot because of the Holocaust and because, as I said last week, and we talked about the Crusades last week, and we talked about the Inquisition last week and the expulsions in Spain. The Holocaust, on one hand, was a unique event in human history. Nothing on that scale has ever happened to anybody, any group of people like that. On the other hand, there also is an aspect of the Holocaust that it's a continuum. It's part of uh, a continuation of pogroms and persecutions that had been going on in Europe for 1,000 years. And so we talked a little bit about that last week, and then this week we're going to talk about it a little bit in more in depth, and specifically right now, because in 1648, one of the darkest chapters in Jewish history in Europe happened. It's something we call the Chmelnytsky massacres. And Bogdan Chmelnytsky was a Ukrainian who led an uprising against the Poles. The Poles during the 1600s were going through kind of a good time. And I say a good time because Poland would go up and down as far as whether it even existed. Because, like some of you know this, up until World War One, from about the 1800s, early 1800s to pretty much after Napoleon, all the way through to 19 until literally the end of World War One to 1980, for 100 years, Poland had not existed as a country until after World War One. That's when Europe said, Poland, you get a country back. But for the previous 100 years, Poland hadn't even existed. And so Poland had ups and downs over its history because it was kind of sandwiched between Germany and Russia, two much bigger empires. And so what happened during the 1650s was that Poland had kind of reached a better place. And through a series of wars and alliances that they had, including with Lithuania, which some of us have ancestors that come from Lithuania, the Poles were able to establish a greater power center. Well, part of that was that they got areas that had been part of what we would call today Ukraine. And why I say what we would call Ukraine is because Ukraine is also a country that's gone through times when it existed and when it didn't exist. And in 1648, a Ukrainian landowner, essentially like a nobleman in Ukraine named Bogdan Khmelnytsky, led a devastating massacre across parts of Ukraine and parts of Poland, which was, again, at that time part of Poland, literally massacring Jews wherever they were, rounding them up and killing them, massacring them, tens of thousands. We don't even know how many people were murdered. It can go up to 40, 50, maybe even 100,000 Jews were massacred during this time. And you go, well, yeah, compared to the Holocaust, that's nothing. But it was it was devastating, the Khmelnytsky massacres, because what we don't realize, which we don't talk about, and it's probably something that you're going to find a little shocking, is if you look at this timeline that I'm sharing right now, look at what the Jewish population in around 1700 was. Yeah, that's the worldwide population of Jews is only about 1 million. And if you look at it, the largest chunk of them live in Eastern Europe, which is this area. So roughly 10% of the Jewish community was murdered. Well, actually, you can see it was 1.3 million, and then this you can see that a large amount of them in the 1490s came out of Western Europe. It's primarily Spain, and are now, in Eastern Europe. And in real terms, there's now less Jews, but around that time, about 10% of the Jewish community in Poland and in that area of Ukraine was murdered during the Khmelnytsky uprisings. Now, for us, it becomes like Khmelnytsky is a Hitler. I mean, every Jew knows who he is. the events become part of the Jewish consciousness for generations until the Holocaust. But this was part of Ukraine's history. And what's interesting is that Khmelnytsky is considered a hero by Ukrainians. As a matter of fact, if you go to Kiev, this is downtown Kiev, and I don't recommend going to Kiev right now, but I was there in 1989 and I saw this statue. This is a statue of Khmelnytsky in downtown Kiev, in the biggest square in Kiev. This is in Kiev, folks. Kiev, as we call it now in the Ukrainian pronunciation. Kiev, the greatest hero of Ukrainian history to some extent is this guy, the guy responsible for murdering maybe 10% of the Jewish community. Now you can understand, folks, why when Russia was talking about the fact that Ukrainians are anti Semites, Ukrainian Jews knew this. This statue was allowed to stand even during the Soviet Union. I told you, I saw this in 1989. The reason was is that Khmelnytsky allied himself with the Russians, and because he was an ally of the Russians, the Soviet Union allowed him because they had even though the Soviet Union was not just Russian, they had a very Russian-centric idea, and so they liked the idea of Khmelnytsky because he kind of he cemented the relationship between Russia and Ukraine because he was so pro-Russian, Khmelnytsky. So they allowed statues of Khmelnytsky. And when I talked to Jews in Ukraine in 1989, they told me if Ukraine is ever separated, if Ukraine is ever able to be independent, we're dead. The fact that they have a Jewish president now is not something that they ever would have believed because this guy is still the national hero. This is TripAdvisor, folks. The Khmelnytsky Monument is a place where people go. I really admired this statue. He's the George Washington of Ukraine. And that's why Jews always feel a little scared by Ukrainian independence and Ukrainian nationalism. This is still there. So we talk about statues in America of Robert E. Lee or whoever is up. This is like a statue of until 1939. If you ask Jews who lived in Poland, if you ask your ancestors who the worst villain in history was, it was this guy, Khmelnytsky. He was the Hitler until we had a much darker time. Because if you kill 10% of Ukraine's Jews, you're a horrible villain. But if you murder 90% of Ukraine's Jews, which virtually happened during the Holocaust, that's a whole nother story. So this happens in the mid 1600s, around the 17th century. By the way, this is when the Pilgrims were in America, right? That's what's happening in this country. And Jews are just starting to be able to come back to England. This is what happened. This horrible rampage, the Khmelnytsky pogroms. And a lot of Jews today have no idea. They've never heard of it. They've never heard of Khmelnytsky. I mean, and most of you have not heard of him, correct? I'm guessing.
Correct.
Never
I
heard. This is the first time I've ever heard of this guy.
Yeah, well, if you wanted to do a deeper dive in him, I could never figure out again, like, how how people, first of all, don't know who he is, and second of all, that that people, were upset about statues of people who own slaves, and this is like, I don't want to say there's no comparison. We can't compare trauma, but folks, I mean, this is that's a real story, man. I did a short version of it, but that's a real story. Yeah.
Was he motivated by the same things that motivated the Nazis?
Interestingly, a lot of it was economic. So if you want to say that this, for him, wiping out the Jewish agents for the Polish landlords, which I mentioned to you is one of the reasons why Poland was one of the few countries where Jews were welcomed in Europe. Yeah, it was economic, and but there were elements of racial and religious. It was definitely religious, but and there were Jews that were taken as captives, and there were Jews that were forced to convert.
But the
Yeah,
Nazis,
but the
you know,
not, but
there was that
but
movie, there was that movie with Kenneth Branagh with the Modernity Conference,
yeah, the Von C
but
conference. Yeah,
yeah, where they're really getting into the whole thing about racial this and how
yeah,
much Jewish blood, and
yeah.
it gets really
Yeah,
twisted.
well, that's why the Nazis were a little bit different. We're going to get to that. We're going to get to that. That's coming. That's on the horizon today. It'll be today. But so yeah, the Khmelnytsky pogroms. One of the part of the legacy of this is something we talked about before, which was the Sabbatean movement. Shabtai Tzvi, who was a Jewish messiah, he was considered by some people he was going to bring in this new age of Jewish autonomy. That he was going to go and he was going to get the Sultan to allow the Jews to come back to Israel. Of course, he was captured by the Turks. He was forced to convert to Islam. He became a Muslim, and his followers became part of a secret sect, a cult called the Donma. And the Donma still has people in Turkey. There's still people that trace their ancestry back to the Donma. Some people say that Kemal Ataturk, the father of modern Turkey, was part of the Donma, which is one of the reasons why he was maybe a little bit more favorably disposed to the Jews, and maybe a little less, Muslim than I mean, he was really didn't wanted Turkey to be a secular culture. But the Sabbatean movement was huge, and there were many, many thousands of Jews who really believed the Messiah was going to come. But the reason why they did that, why they had that messianism, was because of the pogroms. This idea that the dark right before the dawn, which is again kind of what happened after the Holocaust, that this kind of messianism was an outgrowth of this horrific pogrom. It also fueled the rise of Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. What became Hasidic Judaism really came out of this, which is again this consciousness of, gosh, I mean, we we have to have some kind of light, even if we have to create it. And so people really were starving for that. So again, this happens right after the Shabbatai Tzvi movement is like the 1660s. By the way, it's also when Jews were starting to be able to come back to England, and some people felt that that was also part of like this new era where there was things happening where people thought maybe this is a new age, and it wasn't. Eventually, the Sabbatean movement comes to an end. That wasn't the only that wasn't the only uh, messianic movement. There was a group that followed another messianic pretender, Jacob Frank. They became the Frankists. They actually, some of them became. Frank was forced to convert to Christianity, and his followers also kind of created a cult. Look, the Sabbatean movement, we don't talk a lot about it because it's kind of embarrassing, but it was pretty it created a lot of disillusionment when it didn't work. But the Sabbateans were doing some pretty wild stuff. It's hard to know exactly what they were doing because we have the Jewish take on what they were doing, but they were dabbling in some weird stuff, some weird sexual practices, uh, some stuff that again, it's hard to know exactly what they were doing, but they were not. In the end, it was a complete disaster, and it was a fraud, and it was very disillusioned. The disillusionment would be the word to summarize what happened. And so it doesn't happen then. And for about the next 100 years, the Jewish community, as you can see, goes through an interesting period of growth, specifically in Eastern Europe. So what comes after this horrible pogrom is actually an explosion of the Jewish population. So that over the next 100 years or so, the Jewish population triples, but it's almost exclusively in
Eastern
in
Europe.
Eastern Europe, right? Now, some of those you can see, some of those people are moving to Western Europe. And the reason they're moving to Western Europe is because in 1800, early 1800s, the next biggest thing happens. And it's again, it's a thing that a lot of Jewish people don't know about. It's kind of one of these footnotes of Jewish history, but it is one of the most important things that most Jews don't know about. And that is there is a dude, and you know the guy. His name was Napoleon, and everyone knows Napoleon. But Napoleon had a very interesting legacy, especially when it comes to the Jews. He did not like the fact that the church, in his mind, specifically the Catholic Church, the church that controlled France and much of Europe, had done a horrible job of separating and essentially, the Catholic Church was a rival to the to governments in Europe and had really hurt Europe. Now, I don't want to get into that, but the Dark Ages were the Middle Ages were the Middle Ages for one really important reason, and that was there really wasn't any kind of authority in Europe. And the authority that was there was the church, and the church really did a horrible job of playing countries, or not, they weren't even countries yet, playing these kingdoms against each other. And Napoleon knew it, and he was 100% correct. But of course, he was going to be the dictator. He was going to be the emperor over this unified Europe, and he almost achieved it. Napoleon's Europe was immense, right? It went from Spain all the way across to Russia. And so it included France and Germany and Poland and all these countries. And he really was able to, for a few years, create something which to some extent people are still searching for, which is a organized and unified Europe. And one of the things that he did was he said people need to be fully integrated into their countries regardless of their religion. That was enormous. That was a game changer. He said that Jews should be able to have full citizenship in the country. And he convened in 1806 a meeting of Jews, of rabbis and leaders in his empire now. And then in 1807, he brought them all back and he established what was called the Grand Sanhedrin. He decided to create a Jewish court modeled on the Jewish courts from that ended during the Roman period. And the purpose of the Sanhedrin, what he charged the Sanhedrin with in 1807, by the way, and this is like at the height of Napoleon's power, he wanted Jews to be integrated into French society. He wanted Jews to be loyal to the country. And he wanted people to be able to economically be integrated back into uh, the country. And he knew that if the Jewish bankers and the Jewish lending network that I mentioned last week had already started during the Middle Ages, if he had access to that, and not only access, but control of that, he was going to do really, really well. And
Rabbi,
yeah,
that explains my uh, paternal grandmother, whose family was French Jews.
yeah. Well,
That's how they
the,
came there. They came there.
so when Jews were living in Poland or living in other parts of the empire, saw what was happening and saw the opportunities, and again the fact that Napoleon was going to say Jews can go to university, Jews can have civil rights, Jews don't have to forget civil rights, like they don't have to live in a ghetto anymore. Jews don't have to live in a part of the city which is the only part that they're allowed to live in. He said no more ghettos. And the effect of that was huge. And it was a part, of course, as his empire eventually collapsed, France was one of those places where even though he was gone, and of course he ended up coming back for a little bit, and the effect of Napoleon in France was obviously a lot greater. Those rights became really a really big part of France, and it did have a legacy in nearby countries like what would become Austria and what would become Germany and even Italy, because those parts of Western Europe that were under his control, once they had done away with the ghettos, once they did away with these restrictions, there was really no going back. And there was during the 1840s, Jews were still struggling to achieve full rights in Germany and Austria and a lot of these countries in the 1800s. But that's why you start to see Jews living in Western Europe, which is this blue part, and you start to see Jews really expanding their population. And then literally over the next 60 years or so, the Jewish community jumps by another factor of over two, right? And if you look at it also in real terms, if you go from 1825 to 1939 to the eve of World War II, the Jewish population goes up over fivefold. Now, of course, we're going to get to the red part. That's us. But you can see what happens in Eastern Europe. The Jewish community there just explodes. And it really, really explodes, especially again in those parts of Europe that Jews are allowed to live in. We're going to get to that. Because as this is happening in Western Europe, especially in those parts of France and Germany, that in some cases, we told you last week, some of those countries Jews were not able to live in from the kind of the period of the Crusades for the next like 500 years in some of those places. The Jewish community goes through, again, a very rapid rise in numbers, but also starts to have to deal with an issue that never confronted them. Once they're no longer in ghettos and once they're no longer confined to shtetls, now they were, by the way, in Eastern Europe, we're going to get to that. But as if they follow Napoleon back to France, or if they follow whatever, if they're now in part of Germany that's now more liberal, secularized, they now are confronted with a choice. Do I have to still be part of a Jewish community? Now, Napoleon's Sanhedrin, the job of those rabbis is to figure out how can we as rabbis integrate and help Jews do what Napoleon wants, which is get them integrated. And so this is where we have the rise, the beginning of Reform Judaism. Reform Judaism's objective, and they don't necessarily even know they don't call themselves Reform yet, but what they are trying to do is figure out how to make Judaism compatible with the life that a Jew would have if they're no longer in a ghetto and they're now integrated into society. If they have a job, if they are going to school, how can they do this? And the real center of this winds up not being France, but Germany. And that's partly because of Germany's interesting political situation at the time, but also because there's one guy in particular, a guy by the name of Moses Mendelssohn, who's a genius. He's literally one of those kinds of savants that's able to grasp the culture that he's around. He's a rabbi, he understands Jewish tradition, and he tries to integrate, and he's very well loved by Christians, but he also is true to his Judaism. He keeps kosher, he keeps Shabbat, but he really tries to make Jews effective parts of Germany, and he does an amazing job. Now, he does such a good job that his grandson no longer is really Jewish. Though, by the way, people always said he was Jewish, and he knew he was Jewish, but he wrote a lot of Christian music. His name is Felix Mendelssohn. He, he's one of the most famous German composers of all time. And he wrote, of course, the Wedding March, and he wrote a lot of stuff that you know, Felix Mendelssohn. That's Moses Mendelssohn's grandson. And both him and, by the way, Felix's sister was a composer as well. Were very integrated into German society, but still also knew that they were Jewish. Their father and mother, they were. I mean, the Mendelssohn kids were genetically and by Hitler's definition were Jewish, which is one of the things that really upset Hitler because Hitler knew how important Mendelssohn was. But you did have a lot of Jews in Germany and Austria and in that surrounding areas that began to actually become Christian because they said, look, we don't we don't have to be Jewish anymore. And if we all we have to do is become Christian in order to get into the highest levels of society, it wasn't such a big deal anymore. And so that was a reality that you started to have in the 1850s. The beginnings of Reform Judaism, the beginnings of synagogues that held services where the music was very influenced by the local community. So German music, the Mendelssohn style music made its way into the synagogue service, and there were choirs and there were many things that people would say, "Oh, I feel comfortable with that because I know people in the church next door are doing the same thing." The architecture, and we're going to see some of those synagogues that survived or have been rebuilt after Kristallnacht that have that style that looks like a contemporary church from Germany in the 1800s as well. So you have that, and again, in response to that, you have an Orthodox movement that begins to define itself because of the Reform movement. And we're going to have a separate class talking about these different movements. But you have the rise of really, for the first time, you have something that's called Orthodox Judaism, uh, traditional Judaism, which defines itself because of Reform Judaism. Until there's something called Reform Judaism, there is not anything that's called Orthodox Judaism. Orthodox Judaism needs to define itself as traditional Judaism as opposed to the new reforms that are taking place. And the reforms taking place, by the way, are still in some ways very traditional. I mean, you will not find a woman rabbi yet at this point in the 1850s. You will not find certain things that eventually become part of Reform Judaism, let's say in America. But it does happen in the 1850s, which is why some of the first Jews that come to this country, come to the United States from Germany, are already familiar with Reformed tradition back from where they were in in Germany. So that's what happens out of this, and what also happens out of this is something that Philip alluded to already, which is we now have a new way of defining Judaism. Because if Jews are converting and they're some guy like Felix Mendelssohn is Christian and writes music for churches and stuff like that, is he still Jewish? And so now you begin to have racial anti-Semitism. And now you have a problem where people, even if they don't care about the religion of the Jew, they start to say there's something about that person that makes them not us. And if it's not religion anymore, if it's not, if it's not, if it's not the language that they speak, because they're not really speaking Yiddish anymore. They're speaking German, or they're fully like not even speaking Yiddish, or they're speaking French, or they're speaking Hungarian. It ain't that. It's that there's something ethnic about them. There's something racial about them. And this is where we start to get racial anti-Semitism. Really comes out of this because it's not going to go away. Anti-Semitism is not going to go away. It's going to change it's going to change the trigger. The trigger changes, but the hatred doesn't go away. And it really finds its greatest manifestation in the Dreyfus affair in France. And that's where this country, right, that gave rise to the Sanhedrin and to some extent where it all started with Napoleon, we have during the 1800s, and if the Dreyfus affair became literally one of the game changers when Dreyfus in the late 1800s, a very well respected French officer is accused of being a traitor, working for the Germans, and he is set up. It's a complete setup, and he's arrested. He's tried and convicted on by people who are completely lying against him, and he is the trial splits France. It becomes the original trial of the century, and the trial happened in 1894, and he's convicted and he's sent to Devil's Island, South America, and he survives. And eventually, they 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 realize, of course, it becomes through revelations and the fact that people still in France were knew he had been railroaded, uh, he ends up being vindicated.
The famous movie about
Yeah,
Jacques.
that.
called Jacques.
Yeah.
And so Emile Zola was the Gentile writer who wrote in defense of him. And this happened literally at the turn of the century. We're talking about the 1890, late 1890s, beginning of the 1900s. And when he's restored, it becomes, people realize that the anti-Semitism that had existed for centuries in Europe had not gone away. And out of this horrible trial, which happened again in a what was a modern Western European country, was the realization that this emancipation, there's something still wrong here.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
was this because France was looking for a scapegoat for the defeat in the Franco-Prussian War? Was
So
that it?
so so they were definitely that definitely hit them, right? Because this was when France and Germany were in almost constant battles, and parts of Alsace, which is the region that he was from, and that was like, why is he guilty? Because he's, really secretly German, and uh, yeah, I mean, it was part of the fact that they were looking for a reason, but it was so obvious to so many people that this was a complete setup that what it exposed was that this was a way to harness anti-Semitism. And remember, like, people who didn't just care about the war, I mean, the whole country you had to have a feeling about it. I mean, it was like, we saw with the OJ, situation, where everyone weighed in on it, everyone had an opinion about it. And so however it started, and again, it had a lot to do with France's feeling of lack of power. And remember, France was still going through lots of internal problems too. Yeah, that this was part of it. But if it can happen there, we got a problem. And of course, some of you know this. There was a reporter from Germany, or actually from Hungary, but he was a German. He worked in German, named Theodor Herzl, who was a very assimilated Jew, assimilated to the point that this young Herzl, who was literally just out of university, is sitting there in 1894 watching what's happening there, and 1898, and he says, "Oh my God, I thought as a Jew living in more of a German. Again, he was from Hungary, but he was very, very drawn to German culture, not Hungarian culture, German culture. But he saw what was happening, and he said, "Hey, the Europe, Western Europe, is not. It's not the paradise that we thought it was going to be once we were integrated." Listen, Herzl never had a bar mitzvah. He was never raised with any Judaism in his house. I mean, he knew he was Jewish, but didn't go to synagogue, didn't know Hebrew, nothing. He was completely assimilated. And he's sitting there as an assimilated Jew, sitting there in a court in France, writing about this trial. And he realizes, we're, we're doomed. And so he realizes that there needs to be a political solution for the Jews. And he didn't invent Zionism, the idea that Jews could return back to their homeland, but he realizes that that's the only way Judaism is going to survive, is with a homeland. We have to normalize Jews with a national identity, because if everyone's going to throw a racial and non-religious hostility towards us, we probably should at least have that, because we don't have any protection. And he foresaw what happened in the Holocaust, even though, again, he would have been devastated to know the Germans were responsible for it. He knew um, that assimilation was not going to save us. And he proposed it, by the way. I mean, he literally at one point said every Jew should convert to Christianity, but be protected as Jews now by the church. He didn't know, like, he was searching for an answer for what could save the Jewish people. And he realized the only way was for them to live in their homeland. And by the way, we're not even sure that Herzl himself would have ever done this. He just knew that For the mass of Jews to survive, they had to get out of, there had to be a solution. See, he wanted everyone to get out of Europe, but he's like, we can't, this is not going to protect us. We're not protected by Western civilization. He was right. Now, he also knew because in the 1890s, there was also something else going on in the world. And as you see back out here on this map, on this timeline, there's a huge amount of Jews living in Eastern Europe. And who's controlling most of Eastern Europe in the 1880s, folks? It ain't Poland. It ain't Ukraine. It's the Russian Empire. And you know this because your family, most of your families lived under the Russian Empire. Most of your families were living under, technically under Russian authority. I've seen my great grandfather's immigration papers. He was born in Poland, but it doesn't say Poland, it says Russian Empire. Jews during the 1800s lived in a special part of Russia called the Pale of Settlement. It was the only part of Russia that they could live. And I'm going to get to it because the pogroms started even before, to some extent, the Pale was mandated. Everyone's heard the word pogrom before, and understand that as Napoleon is talking about what's going on in France, these are going on, these pogroms are going on in Russia, in the Russian Empire, and it's we're talking about Ukraine, Poland, Russia, Lithuania.
But Rabbi,
Yeah.
when I was a
When I was
child,
in shop.
my grandfather, I remember as a kid, he would tell me stories about the Cossacks coming.
Yeah.
Is that was that a program? He said they would have to flee the village because the Cossacks would come and use guns and swords and kill everyone.
Yeah. There's a couple of things there. Yes, that happened. That's what you see in Fiddler on the Roof when you see the the pogrom that goes on there, where the Jews are attacked, and the guy warns them that they're going to, the police chief warns them that they're going to be attacked. But interestingly enough, it wasn't just Cossacks. When they talk about Cossacks, there's an interesting thing. A lot of them were Cossacks, but a lot of them were not Cossacks. Cossacks are really one group in particular, which are the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian Cossacks. When your grandfather talked about Cossacks, what was interesting about that is something that I just told you. The Cossacks became the Cossacks, the Nazis, if you will, because of the Khmelnytsky pogrom. Those were Cossacks. Khmelnytsky led, the people he led were Cossacks. Now, it's not that some of these pogroms were not also done by Cossacks, technically, but the reason that they became just all called Cossacks was because of the Ukrainian Khmelnytsky pogrom.
So I have a question
So,
then.
so we, do you understand? So we started calling every Gentile Russian or Ukrainian that killed us Cossack, but
Yeah,
really some of them were technically not Cossacks
but then why would they tell my grandfather? Because I remember these stories so well. Why would they tell this Jewish teenager, you will be conscripted into the Russian army? Why would
Yeah,
they take a Jew?
because eventually what they would do would be they would let me take you through this. Okay, so the first pogrom that we kind of talk about that was an organized pogrom against the Jews where the government sponsored it, where the government allowed it to happen, or again, you know, literally led it in some cases, was the 1821. There was a pogrom in Odessa. And Odessa was a major city, a Jewish city, huge cosmopolitan city on the Black Sea, right? It's one of Ukraine's major cities to this day. But at the time, it was Russia. It was controlled by the Russian Empire, and the Jews of Odessa were targeted. by mob violence. But what follows over the next 50 years or so are minor kinds of pogroms, the kind of pogroms that you see, in Fiddler on the Roof. But from 1881 to 1884, there was a wave where we really call these the pogroms, because this wasn't in one city. This was all across Ukraine, Poland, and southern Russia. What happened in 1881 was Tsar Alexander II was assassinated. And of course, the Jews were blamed for his assassination. What happened after that was, a, I mean, just a, Jews were like, what do we do? I mean, the government is not going to protect us. The government's allowing us to be attacked and is blaming us. There's people in the Russian government that are literally blaming us for this. It's when we see the rise of the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And in 1881, the pogroms start, and they go on for about the next 4 years. And the Russian government completely allows it to happen, encourages it to happen, and to some extent takes away what is beginning to build already in the 1880s of real political dissent by Russian peasants against the government. I mean, that's why he was killed. That's why Alexander II is killed. But it sets up what eventually, of course, will again, only 30 years later, as you know, the Russian Revolution. So over the next 30 years, you have a couple of things that happen. So wait, that's the first major wave. But what it what it does is back to again looking at 1880. You see how many Jews are living in Eastern Europe here. Well, wait a second. By 1939, there's now a whole bunch of Jews in the red, which is us. And it's also South Africa. It's not South Africa. It's Australia. It's Jews getting out of Eastern Europe, and again, also coming to Western Europe, and also coming to Israel. What happens after these first waves is over the next 40 years, over 2 million Jews will leave Eastern Europe, and the vast majority of them will come here to this red area, to um, America. This is when your family came. Your family came to America between 1880 and 1924. How do I know that? Because they did. I know they did. But this is not the last of the pogroms. There's another um, horrible pogrom in 1903 in Kishinev, which was photographed by the 1900s. You have photographs and you have accounts that people can now, there's telegraphs and people can now, let people know what's going on because again, Russia was one of the last areas of Europe to be industrialized, to get technology. But the Kishinev pogrom is horrible, and a lot of Jews leave that area of Moldova. It's still part of Russia. It will become part of the Soviet Union when Moldova is a republic of the Soviet Union. But the Kishinev pogrom was horrible and photographed, and there's horrible photographs of the Kishinev pogroms. Um, and that area, by the way, is Moldova, is Russia along the Black Sea, also goes right to Romania. It's an area called Bessarabia. So if you have family that was from Bessarabia, that's also Moldova. That's also that area, Bessarabia. Sounds like it's Arabia. It's not. Bessarabia. Bessarabia is that area of Kishinev. That's an Kishinev is the capital of Moldova. But again, Jews come to Israel. They come to the United States. They come to Ottoman Empire, Israel. And again, what's one of the other big things that happens during this time? Jews become socialist. The Jews who stay in the Russian Empire, they're like, we're done with the Tsar. He's not protecting us. Let's become let's become Soviet. Let's become communist. Let's do away with the Tsar. and do away with religious persecution, which is what the communists were saying we're going to be. And that's why so many of the earliest socialist leaders in the Soviet Union were Jews. A lot of them, a lot of them, as you know.
But Rabbi,
People
I'm
like
I'm
People like Trotsky. I
I'm
mean,
still trying to figure out why the Russians would have wanted to draft my grandfather.
because we're going to get to this. So
Okay, I'm
in
sorry.
19, no, it's okay. In 1905, we have another wave of pogroms in Russia, and again, even more people get out of Russia and Poland. This is when my one of my sides from Poland came out in 1907 because of this next wave. Uh, Again, Bialystok, Kiev, all these places. This is the revolution of 1905, which is the failed revolution. This is a revolution that causes the country to go through horrible, horrible internal dissension, and people are really, really trying to figure out what to do, right? But what else also happens during this time? And this gets to the question of what happens with Philip's grandfather. What happens in 1904, 1905? The Russians and the Japanese fight a war. And part of the reason why we have this horrible dissension inside Russia is because Russia is challenged by Japan. Japan! And Russia needs soldiers. And so they forcibly conscript Jews. And Jews are taken out of their homes and during this period, and they never see their family again. Young Jewish boys, 12, 13, 14. They're taken out of their parents' homes and they never come back.
This, thank you. This is the first time anyone's explained it to me. This is exactly when he left.
Philip, there's some stories that came out of this time that are still chilling. I remember people telling me that their grandfather had his finger cut off by his parents so that he couldn't have a trigger finger, so he couldn't be conscripted into the war.
He he got on a ship and never saw his family again.
Because again, sending your kid to America with nothing was a better choice than having him being taken away and never seeing him again by the Russians, or having to cut off his finger and disabling him so he can get out of battle, and even that might not work. Those are the choices that Jews are forced to deal with here. And as the Russian Empire is going down the toilet, they are now going to also, during this period of time, force Jews to only live in this area. Jews are only allowed to live in this area called the Pale of Settlement. So when you talk about like in the 1900s, here's Bessarabia. This is where Kishinev is, right on the border with Romania. This is Ukraine, the area where a lot of your families came from. This is Poland, which you can see as part of the Russian Empire. This is Belarusia, places like Minsk and Pinsk, right? And here's Vilna, Lithuania. So this area, these areas were the only areas that Jews were allowed to live in. They weren't allowed to live in St. Petersburg. They weren't allowed to live in Moscow. They had to live further west. This was the only area they were allowed to live. And
Excuse
so,
me,
yeah,
the word, the town, is this the town Slutsk? Slutsk in
yeah.
Belarusia?
Uh-huh.
Okay, was that part of Poland?
Well, it,
Because my maiden name is Slut.
yeah,
My father said they came from Poland, but he said the name wasn't shortened, but I think it probably was.
could be,
So would that have been
could
in
be,
considered
could,
Poland?
yeah, it could be, but it also could be another town in because Poland really kind of only well Poland after I'll show you real quick. Poland after after World War One, Polish history is not what I'm teaching, but it is very interesting because look, a lot of our families came from Poland, like mine. And so I'm going to show you a real interesting thing that happened to Poland. And Poland knows this, and that's why Poland, sometimes has after World War One. So I'm going to show you um, I'm going to show you this map real quick of Poland. So Poland had Poland had after World War One, this was the map of Poland. So technically speaking, this part of where Sloot would be, which is like right about here, there's Minsk and Sloot. There's Minsk. Where's Minsk? I just saw it. Minsk is here. It would be right about here. So wait, Minsk is here. Sloot it would be right about on the border. So it could have been part of Poland when he left, but um, but that's what it looked like after World War One, before World War Two. After World War Two, when Poland became a country again, Poland did not get any of this area. This was all taken over by the Soviet Union. Part of it was Lithuania, part of it was Belarusia, part of it was Ukraine, but they didn't get it. And instead, they got this part of what sometimes was Germany. This became part of Poland. So this is now Poland. Poland shifted over to the west so that the Soviet Union could have a little bit more of Poland. So yeah, I mean it's possible that it is Slut, um, but you'll hear people whose last name is Slutsky, which is kind of an unfortunate name to have, I guess. It's yeah, they're from Slutsk.
Alan's
So
family came from Vitebsk. I could see it up there.
yep, this is the only place, the only when your family was finally leaving, all it was your family, our families, all of our families were leaving. That's where they were leaving from. They were leaving from this area, from the Pale of Settlement. You might have heard of the Pale. It's like the Pale. This is the Pale. It was called the Pale of Settlement. This is the areas that they could live in. And again, primarily it's Ukraine and Poland, but parts of Russia that parts of the Russian Empire that the Russians, quite frankly, didn't care about. Now, now we're gonna now we're gonna tell people the truth, which is again, people, people as we saw, they're coming to after this period, they're coming to United States. They're going to many of them will stay. And of course, they're also going to Israel. This gray part is Israel. But I want to show you what happened in America because this is really important. This is why we are here. This was the Jewish population before the pogroms, 280,000. Over the last, pretty much over the last 70, 80 years, the Jews that were coming from Germany. And as we said before that, they were pretty much Sephardic Jews. But literally, around this time, there's 100,000 Jews in the whole country. In 1880, before the pogroms, there's 280,000, 300,000 Jews. Once the pogroms start, the Jewish community triples. And then it triples again. And then it doubles again. So that over this period, when your family came here, the Jewish community goes from a community of about 300,000 to a community of about 5 million. Now, that's because 2 million of us came. I already told you that. 2 million of us, 2 million of our grandparents, great grandparents made that journey across, and in some cases by themselves. My great grandfather came here by himself. His family sent him from Zhytomyr in Ukraine by himself to be with his sister in Canada, never to see them again. Why?
Rabbi,
Yeah, because the alternative was going into the Russian army or dying. Yeah. Yes.
hold on. Yeah, but hold on. But you and I have had this discussion multiple times. from I guess from 20 to 50, right? You're seeing a big jump from 40 to 50, but you know, maybe you got to walk a little tightrope here, but there's a reason why you didn't see more from 20, 30, and 40. You know that too.
Yeah. Yeah, and the population here, that's why we ended in 1930 because the population goes up again a little bit, but not like this. Because again, the United States will not let Jews in during this next period from the late 20s on. Now, part of it, the argument is that Jews are communists. Well, there were some truth to that, but of course that's not really what it is. It's racism in this country, and it's a reaction to the fact that the Jewish population is now pretty significant. And now you have a Jewish community in the United States that's just come from nowhere. See, this is what like we forget because we know our families came to the country here. But we sometimes forget when they came here, the Jewish community that was here to welcome them. And by the way, they weren't so welcoming in some ways. And we'll talk about this when we talk about the American Jewish history experience, which we're going to devote a class just to the American Jewish history experience, where we'll talk about the immigration shutdown in the late 1920s. But if we think about this, they they were coming primarily to New York, primarily to the East Coast, some to the other places in the East Coast, sometimes to Canada. They People did not know what to do with this influx of people. And it wasn't like there was a Jewish community here that was sizable enough to integrate them. And they didn't really know what to do. And so American Jews were, in some cases, and we're going to talk about it in a greater detail, a little uncomfortable with these Jews that were getting off the boats. They called them greenhorns.
But by the 30s, Rabbi,
Yeah,
American Jews, the Jews in America were starting to wield some political power, some economic power, some power in the law. You had Jewish judges, and I can't imagine that made the you know
yeah.
leadership, the Protestant leadership, WASP, whatever you want to call
We,
it,
we will
that
talk
had
about that. Yeah, we will talk about the quotas. The quotas of immigration started during this period, and the quotas at the universities started in this period.
my
Jews,
uncle,
Jews were able to go to university. Interestingly, a Jew was able to get into Harvard much easier in 1905 than they were in 1930 or
yeah,
19.
my uncle couldn't had the choice to go to medical school, but there were quotas on how many Jews could go. He
100%.
couldn't he couldn't get in, so he ended up at NYU Law School. I mean, it was easier. That's why he became a lawyer. He didn't want to. He wanted to be a doctor.
Yeah.
Couldn't get in.
Well, this is something again we're going to talk about a little bit when we talk about the next period because or when we talk about American Jewish history because we're really going to finish in this last period of time to talk about what happens in Europe and of course to just integrate the Holocaust into this overview of Jewish history. But I want to show you this chart because I showed you and I'm going to go back just so you can see it again. I showed you this chart, which shows where Jews are living in the world. I showed you this chart, which shows what the hold it a second. I showed you what the Jewish population of the United States was in terms of numerical population, which you can see is it's continuing to go up for the most part. That's good, even with assimilation. But this is the chart that I just showed you, which is where it plays out, which is, well, let me show you this. Yeah, everyone sees this chart. So, in terms of what I think is significant for us to kind of consider is that about 80 years ago, the Jewish population reached its highest point as far as what percentage of the United States we were. Now, again,
And
it's
who was
interesting.
president at the time?
At this time, you know who was president during this time. This is FDR's time. But what's interesting here is that as much power as the
Oh,
Jews
no,
had,
no, no. Absolutely not.
go ahead.
Absolutely not.
What?
No, 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 no. Maybe, no, no. Truman had taken over.
No, 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 but this is
No,
19,
no.
this is 1940. Look at this. So in 1950, it's down a little bit, but it reaches its peak right about 1940 as far as percentage goes, right? So it's interest. This is the Jewish population as percentage of the country as a whole. So do you understand what happens is that as the United States population grows, the Jewish population as a percentage of the country has been decreasing ever since 1940. Now, we feel that, we understand that. I mean, we see it to some extent in in major cities, but even with this happening in 1940, Jews are the highest percentage that they ever were in this country and probably will ever be. I don't see this changing dramatically, not with our birth rates and not with um, demographic trends in the United States. I mean, there's no reason to believe that this trend, this line, is not going to continue to go down. Okay. This again, this Jonathan Sarna is the preeminent scholar of American Jewish history, alive, living Jewish scholar of American Jewish history. But I will tell you this: when we go back to 1940, at the pinnacle of our numerical percentage-wise power, we were not able, as Jews in this country, to change our country's policy of engaging in trying to end the murder of Jews in Nazi Germany. Because the German Empire at this time reaches its pinnacle, and there are more Jews, and as Philip pointed out, the Wannsee Conference, where the final solution is finally put into motion as a plan. Remember, Hitler had been in power for 9 years by the time of the Wannsee Conference in 1942. He'd been in power for 9 years. Poland had been under control of the Nazis for, by this point, 3 years. The Jewish communities of under control of the Nazis had been already, many of them had been murdered, but there are still 3 to 4 million Jews that had not been murdered yet. And in that period, the Nazis knew that the rest of the world was not going to stand in their way from obliterating the rest of the Jews of Europe.
That's
And
that's an interesting point you bring up too, Rabbi. Had Japan not attacked us, they would have been successful.
yeah,
The most insane thing about that movie, which if you haven't seen, you have to watch it. Couple of things. One,
called
there's
Wannsee.
not,
It's called Wannsee. All right.
yeah,
Well, wait. There's different. There's a German version of it as well.
the Kenneth Branagh one.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
one with Kenneth Branagh. First of all, there's no violence in the movie. Nobody gets shot, stabbed, blown up. There's no blood and gore, and yet it is the most depraved, sickening thing you'll ever see. But what really makes it so important is that the dialogue is from the reporter's transcript
Yeah.
of the meetings. The Nazis were so anal and obsessive that they had court reporters taking all of this down. So it's not like some Hollywood screenwriter made it all up. It's the
Yeah,
real
How do you
stuff.
spell that movie? I
no,
don't understand.
it's so Wannsee was the German version of it. The movie that he's talking about with Kenneth Branagh and Stanley Tucci, for Stanley Tucci fans, It's called Conspiracy. And
Okay.
by the way, I just looked it up. It has 100. It has 100 in Rotten Tomatoes. So it's not just Philip telling you to
Is it
see.
on like Netflix or something?
What is Conspiracy on? Uh, it is, as he said, it is not a violent movie. There's no dead bodies. There's nothing. There's nobody killed during the movie. I think there's nobody killed in the movie. Came out in 2001. You can see it on Amazon Prime, but you have to probably pay for it.
Okay.
Apple TV, it's available for $3.99 on Apple TV, and it looks like maybe it's even on HBO Max. So if you have
I,
HBO, you might
Yeah,
be
I
able to
do.
watch it for free.
Rabbi, I think really arguably, I'm going to say it's the most powerful movie about the Holocaust that I've ever seen because it is so dry, so matter of fact.
Well,
You
it
know,
also has, yeah, it has amazing cast. So
and the acting is insanely good. But here's the thing: while they're talking about how they're going to do all this, they're catering lunch
yeah,
like
yeah,
it's no big deal.
yeah. And again, when we understand and take into consideration what happened during that and why, look, we're going to talk about it more when we deal with the Holocaust, I promise you. And again, it's a good time for me to just tell people this is one of the reasons why we're doing this trip to Europe again, is so that people can see these places and they can understand the history of our people during, in the countries where this happened, um, where these things literally, where these things happened. It's very powerful to be there for that. But understand that the people at that conference were geniuses. They were literally brilliant minds, and they were the most devious people. And my friends, they were largely successful. They were able to obliterate 90% of the Jewish community in Poland. If you were a Jew who lived in Poland in 1938, you had a 90% chance of being murdered. That's unheard of. That's why when people talk about genocide and they throw out words like the Jews or, Israel's become, that's why it's so offensive. Because this, the Nazis were largely successful at obliterating the Jewish community of Europe. You have to understand that. They were successful. When people say they were stopped or that we ended the Nazis and the Nazis were defeated, they were. But they were not defeated from their vision of ridding ridding parts of the empire of Jews. The country where there were one of the largest Jewish communities, Poland, had 3 million Jews before the war and less than 300,000 after the war. That's ridiculous. If you don't understand that that was largely successful, you're in denial. So this is why when we talk about the Holocaust and when we try to figure out, yeah, there's pieces of this that are not that nothing like this has ever happened. But there's also pieces of this that literally go back to the beginnings of Jewish history for us as Jews, a continuity of pogroms, a continuity, but never this effective, never this devastating. And so, yeah, it's difficult for us to wrap our heads around it. And again, we're going to talk about that. But when we talk about the Holocaust as a self-contained unit, but to talk about what genocide really is. And again, some people say the first genocide was the Armenian genocide the Turks perpetrated during World War One. But folks, the Turks were not successful at wiping out 90% of the Armenians. This was industrial genocide. This was something that has never happened, hadn't happened, and still has never happened on this scale, ever. And
I
this
guess
isn't
we
like
owe a debt of
these
gratitude to the Japanese, huh?
these are, yes, in a weird way. I mean, in a perverted way. But I mean, you never would want to say because they were pretty violent and pretty horrible to America and to Americans who were unlucky enough to find their way into being captured by them or fighting with them. But um, these are real. I mean, we talked, I mentioned before people that I've met and people you've met. Eddie Hirsch's mother, Mina, who passed away just a couple of years ago. Mina had two sisters and her parents. She was one out of five, was the only person in her family who survived. Both of her sisters were murdered and her parents were murdered. She was the only person that walked out of Poland. She was from Lodz in Poland, and she's the only person from her family that survived. And you know where she went? She went to Israel. That's where she met Eddie's dad. And she met him even before they got stepped foot into the land of Israel, because they met in a displaced persons camp at a DP camp in Cyprus when they were both taken captive by the British to stop them from coming into Israel, even in 1946. So when we talk about Israel, when we come up to the history of Israel, and when we talk about the history of the Holocaust, we're going to talk about some of these things. And I promise you, when we talk about the Holocaust, we're going to talk about some aspects of this that you never realized about the Holocaust. Again, one of them that unfortunately too many of our people don't realize is that from the standpoint of the history of Jews of Poland, it comes to an end in 1945. 1,000 years of Polish Jewish history is obliterated over a period of about 4 years. Yeah. And it's obliterated not just because, every institution is destroyed that's Polish, that for Jews of Poland, that every synagogue and cemetery is vandalized or ruined, but every one of those people that was born there is murdered almost over the period of 4 years. So there's not even anyone who can preserve the memory of those places because they're dead. There's entire families that there's nobody who survived. There's no one who says Kaddish for them. There's no one who remembers them because they were all murdered. And that's why, you know, we, it's impossible for us to ever fully comprehend it, but we have to try. I mean, we have to understand what was lost and the institutions and the history of Jews in Europe comes to an end that's not it's not like, it kind of peters out. It's burned up. So this is why this trip in a few months is so important for us. We haven't done it in 11 years, and this is not a commercial for it, but I want to tell people if you didn't get to go, please join us if you can. It's going to be not just a history of the murder, but to understand and to appreciate what was lost. We had to see it. We got to see what we can see of it and make sure we understand it. And so look, next week, when we talk about the Jewish history of the last 60 or 70 years, it's for the large part, it's not this anymore. It's not this, it's not Europe. It's Israel and it's our homeland. Now, it's the United States and Israel, our two homelands, the place that we're talking to you from, and the place that we also will have a chance to go see this year, which is our homeland of Israel, a trip that we've created that's going to take people to places that they haven't seen before. If you've gone on our previous trips, I was talking to John about this and Glory the other day, and the reality is that this trip, I think John will testify in Glory that we're seeing a lot of places that you guys have never been to before. So this including some of the places that have to do with the beginning of the Israeli army, the first versions of the Israeli army, and again, some of what makes Israel special is that even during these last days of war, Israel's economy has continued to thrive. It's continued to grow, and we're going to go to some of the innovation centers. We're going to go to the Perez Institute of Innovation. We're going to see some of the stuff that's going on in Tel Aviv, some of the technological incubators We're going to go to the Weizmann Institute in Rehovot, which I've never taken a group to, and so we're going to have a chance to see some of those things too. So I'm glad we get to do both trips this year. It's definitely not easy for me, but it's something that I love doing, and I as you all know over these last few weeks, I love the history of our people, and it's tough when we read and deal with the hardest aspects of it, but but it is important for us to be aware of it. It's part of our own literacy to know that history, even the darkest pieces of it. But again, it's not all dark, and we have to also understand, the home that we had in Europe for 1,000 years, lots of rough times, as you saw, but it was also our home. It was also a place where, again, most of us don't have family that's lived in the United States for longer, maybe 100 years. Can you imagine what it's like to live in a place for 1,000 years, to have, you know, 4 or 5 or 6 generations buried in the same cemetery? It doesn't happen. Hasn't happened yet for most American Jews. Maybe have grandparents buried in the same cemetery, but 6 or 7 generations of people buried in the same cemetery. Unfortunately, most of those cemeteries have been also destroyed. But they're there, and that was our home. So we are going to get to coming up. We're going to our next history classes. So next week is our last one of the six, but then we're going to move into kind of more of a chronological step back into some of these history, kind of like a little micro, uh, getting into the weeds a little bit. We're going to have a class going back to the history of Judaism and Christianity, where this kind of during the rabbinic period where this divergence happened. We're going to talk about Judaism and Islam, because when we talk about that, we also talked about Jews under Islam a little bit, and we're going to do a little bit more in that. And then we're going to focus on this European Jewish history and how it gave birth and how it gave rise to Yiddish, and just a discussion about the Yiddish language and how it emerged out of this area, which will also help us on our for those going on our trip to Europe to understand that. And then after that, we're going to get into American Jewish history, um, the Holocaust, which is kind of again, after that period we just looked at where we had this massive immigration, and then into Zionism and into the history of Israel. So those are things that are coming up. Those are some of the classes that we've got on the
Right.
horizon. So um,
You
that's
know,
uh,
Rabbi,
that's it. Yeah,
Rabbi,
yeah.
we've spoken about this before,
Like
but
by before.
you know, to dovetail into this, to finishing this class in regards to Jews migrating to the U.S. you know, I bet you, if we can do a bus tour in Europe, we could do one in the States, up
I
and down
know,
the East Coast.
I know. You've
And
said it before. It is doable. I've kind of looked at the logistics of it, and there are groups that have done it. It's difficult because it's easier to do obviously on the East Coast, right, where you can go to Baltimore and DC, and you go to Philadelphia, and you make your way up through New York, into Boston. It's definitely easier to do there. It's a little bit harder to do what really should be done, which is also a look at the Jewish community down the Mississippi, right? And some of the Jewish communities in the South, or to do. And by the way, by the South, I also include places like Louisville and going all the way down to New Orleans, where there's very interesting Jewish history. So there's different regions which are almost like you got to do one region and then do, because you can't really do DC and up to the New England area and then do that. That would be like a week and a half doing one part. So yeah, maybe there's a couple of regions, and then of course there's also the Midwest region where you go to Chicago, you go to St. Louis, Chicago, kind of from where the South ends, which maybe is St. Louis, and then it goes up north to see Chicago, Milwaukee, even the Twin Cities has an interesting Jewish history. But yeah, there's definitely something that we should understand and kind of see within our American Jewish history. Look, John, in all fairness, our history is really only about 100 years of going back to this major jump in our numbers. So we're still trying to figure out how do we understand American history? Where it's still new. Our history is still, if you think about it, most of us have lived through. We've already lived through half of American Jewish history for the most part. Again, I'm not saying there wasn't American Jewish history before the 1880s, but look, I mean, come on. You're going from a Jewish community of 3 million in the 1820s to, or no, that's a world population. Sorry, the American Jewish population was on this one was like 300,000. You're talking about a Jewish community which had some interesting parts of its history, but come on, it's not a significant. These are not significant numbers, but it is interesting, and it is worth learning and understanding and celebrating, really celebrating that history, because it's quite amazing what we've done in this country. But again, you go from 1880 to this. This is not the same thing, right? This kind of population and this population it's a completely different dynamic. You're talking about a country that now has a Jewish community that actually people can see, that they're visible. Like they're not just, hey, I met a Jew 2 years ago. Now I live. There's a Jewish area of New York. It's the Lower East Side, and it's every sign is in Yiddish. That's the difference between again when we look at this period, which again, think about it. If we go back, if you're born in 1940, 1950, I mean, you've lived through a good chunk of this American Jewish history. So, anyways,
Rabbi,
folks, yeah,
Rabbi, you got to remember that when they couldn't get into the country in Ellis Island and they couldn't get in Miami, they came in through Galveston. And
yep,
we'd be remiss if we didn't make a plea for Texas. Galveston today has a large Jewish population,
no, listen, there's no
and
question.
the main street is called Rosenberg Lane.
There is no question. Thank you, Mr. Schulman, for reminding us of the Jewish. Now, again, this is from a guy from Michigan, by the way. But I want to tell you, no, no, but he's 100% correct. Not only is he 100% correct, my great grandfather, that one who came in 1907, we found out. We didn't find out until about 20 years ago. He came in through Galveston, Texas. So when we finally learned that oh my gosh, we could have wound up. We could have been we could have been we could have been in Texas.
Yeah.
When I found that certificate, it blew my mind.
Then
You
your
know,
Levi jeans would have fit perfectly.
I could wear them and be proud of it. Yeah, no, there would be then that would be, not even be a question. I could talk like Joe Buchanan. I I will no, but I'll tell you, it is when you realize, and it's exactly as David said. They couldn't get all the Jews said, hey, there's too many of us here in New York. We got to get some of these people further to the west. And so the only way to do that was to take people through Galveston. And the Galveston plan was enacted largely by Jews who said, look, if we don't get some of these people out of our community, there's going to be a turn on us. And look, in the end, they got it anyways, right? In the end, within 20 years, they said, hey, no more Jews from Poland anymore, but or Russia, but no more Jews. Forget from anywhere. But yeah, they knew that there was going to be a backlash because people would have said, hey, how do we let all these Jews in here? But yeah. All right, folks. We will see you next week for the last class of Jewish history of this timeline of we did 4,000 years of Jewish history in 6 weeks, but we're not going to finish with Jewish history because again, over the next several weeks, we're going to dive into some of these things that again, how do you talk about the Holocaust for 10 minutes? It's impossible, and it's I would never say, hey, we're going to talk about the Holocaust for 10 minutes. So we didn't. We did today, but only in the context of again thousands of years of Jewish history to get to it. So, oh, and I meant to say, so Gail, yeah, The Renson family was from Vitebsk. Vitebsk.
Hi, Rabbi Blazer.
Yes. How are you?
I'm good, and thank you for doing these classes. They're amazing. I've been I listen to it after because normally I take care of my nephew on Wednesdays, but I got over here on time to watch some of it with mom. So yeah, it's crazy that that at the height of our power of like our influence that we still couldn't stop the Holocaust makes me think about, well, what do we do to combat the anti-Semitism today?
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely. You're
so
you're absolutely right, and it's something that yeah, when you see that statistic and you see those numbers, it's definitely something that we think about. How do we, how do we advocate and how do we remind people that yeah, that this is not a joke. Because the last time we had even oh, really, if you think about it, our percentage has gone down by 50%. We were 3%, now we're less than 2%. And now you're hearing people saying, I'm not going to take any money from APAC. And, how did that happen in 2 years? How did APAC become toxic? It's definitely disturbing because 5 years ago, I thought one of the greatest, and APAC maybe made a huge mistake. I think they had an amazing policy conference every year in DC that we would look forward to going to this time of year, really, usually like a week before Purim. And they stopped doing it during COVID because it cost them a lot of money to do it. But it was a major gathering. It was the biggest gathering of Jews from all different denominations, like Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, secular Jews. Everybody came together, and we would fill the Washington where the Capitals play their whatever they call it now, the Verizon Center, whatever it is, and it was amazing. Thousands of Jews coming together, and now you got literally the governor of California saying, "I'm not going to take. I'll never take any money from APAC. Like that's a badge of honor." I mean, I don't know what to say other than like if you told me that 5 years ago, I would have said you're out of your mind. Look how many people are here. Look how many leaders are here. People would come and everybody was there. I mean, the year that I was there in 2020, Kamala was there in person. Trump sent, Rubio was there, for the Republicans. Pompeo was there. Everybody was there. It was a completely different scene.
yeah.
So I can only tell you again. I know people are going to say it's Israel. It's not, but I'm telling you, I know what a policy conference was. I know what I know because I was there. I saw it. I know that this is something that if we don't get real about it, Sarah,
Mhm.
we got a real problem. We got a
Yeah.
real problem. This is
I
not a
mean,
joke.
anti-Zionism is a hate movement, and it's just another word for anti-Semitism because you can be this thing about you can be critical. I'm just being critical about Israel. You can be critical with not wanting the destruction of the Jewish state. It's
Yeah.
um,
Again, when you articulate this idea that I'm not taking money from APAC, there's a weird subtext, which again, I don't think I'm overly sensitive to it, which is I'm not going to be bought by the Jews. And when people said it in a way, a few years ago when they said it's, when some of these people started saying it's all about the Benjamins, it was you cannot separate that from the Jewish charges of Jews trying to buy people and that those anti-Semitic charges of Jews of Jewish control and Jewish money. And again, I know people are going to say, but you have to I know, and I'm not being overly dramatic about it, that the language is too it's too close. Is it circumstantial? I don't think so, because we've been there, and it's not. You know how close, how much has to happen before people say, um, no, it's all Jews. It doesn't matter if you're a Zionist or not. I mean, we know. Come on. I mean, do we actually have to say it? Is that what's really going to have to happen? Anyways, I hope not. I hope we
yeah,
wake up. So thank you, and it's great to see you, Sarah. I'm glad you're part of our discussions, and that's one of the cool things about doing this online. So Next week will also 100% be online. So next Wednesday. And in the meantime, remember everybody, it's Adar. We're supposed to be happy, and whether you can be with us at Purim for our 80s our 80s theme Purim on Monday night on the 2nd. You can be with us on person. We're also going to be streaming it. And there's going to be a special guest for those who are here in town. Or you can see the person there, but we're going to have a special walk on. We have it'll be a lot of fun. I promise.
Yeah,
All right.
that sounds great. It's good to see you too.
It's great to see you. All right. Take care,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Good to
Bye-bye.
see you, Sarah.
Rebbe.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye, Esther.
Bye.